Okay. Um, so I'm gonna present a few ideas. So bear with me. This might take a little while, but I'm gonna go through and start off with you know just dive right in. So in Carthage, so we know that the door hinges are on the right side of the door if you're viewing from inside the room, and there's evidence that a shot was fired through the latch and lock by the mob attempting to enter the room. We know that Hiram could have sprung backward 2 or 3 steps as a reaction to that shot, as the eyewitness accounts, like John Taylor's account states that. Or, if they shot through the lock and latch and then the mob members just pushed through the door, it could have pushed him back 2 or 3 steps, which is about 10 feet if you're a man my size. So anyone else that was to Hiram's right wouldn't have been knocked back as far if Hiram was knocked back and didn't just jump back a couple of steps, because you're closer to the hinges and there wouldn't be as much mass displacement. So it to me makes complete sense that Hiram was pushed much further back into the room away from the door. And that position, I mean, that we know that room is not very big. So that position 10 feet back from the door would put Hiram's back just a few feet away from the window, making it a target to anyone outside the jail. I believe it's most likely that the first bullet that struck his body was the one in his back, which would not have to cause very much external bleeding, because there's no major blood vessels in that area of the body. And since we know it didn't exit the front of his body, we can be fairly confident based on the evidence that regardless of the cause, the bullet that struck Hiram's back had low terminal ballistic energy. If it had higher terminal ballistic energy, we would expect it to have exited and had an exit wound. So we don't know the caliber of that bullet that struck him in the back. We don't know the firearm that it was shot from for sure. I mean, the hole in his shirt is 0.69 inches, which would be a perfect match for a period musket ball that was shot. But the low terminal ballistics could also be explained by it traveling a much further distance. Like, for example, if it had been fired from much further away from the jail. So like John Taylor, he never claimed he knew the exact source of the bullet that struck Hiram's back, but he conjectured in his account that it could have come from the Carthage graves, which he estimated at 10 to 12 rods, which is about 165 to 200 feet, or roughly 60 yards away, which is well within the effective range of a musket. Rifles, even of that period, were accurate to hundreds of yards, 2, 3, 400 yards away. A good rifleman could hit a target. So an alternative but equally plausible argument, like you said that you had agreed with Sam Weston that he disproved the RLDS angles from the Carthage conspiracy. It's possible that the shot from in the back could have come from a mob member much closer to the jail, but again, it would have had to have a much lower powder load to explain the low terminal ballistics, causing it to not exit the front of his body. Another possibility is if the shooter was shooting from the top of a wagon or from some other elevated position, he could have been much closer to the jail than the 50 to 70 feet away that Sam Weston calculated was plausible. But regardless, either way, Hiram would have known immediately that his gunshot wound to his back was fatal, given the internal damage he could probably feel, and also due to the lack of medical technology back in those days. So Hiram said, "I am a dead man," and he still had a tongue because that was the only ball that had struck him. So now what's interesting. So my background professionally, I deal with medical code data. I manage medical coding databases, and I study quite a bit about human anatomy and such, and so it's a common and widely known phenomenon that people who get shot with a firearm collapse immediately, even if it which kind of is a little counterintuitive, because if the bullet doesn't strike a lower extremity, why do people fall down? Well, a neurologist named Dennis Tobin was asked by a journalist investigating this phenomenon in 2013, and Dr. Tobin theorized that an area of the brain stem called the reticular activating system, or RAS, can become overloaded by like pain impulses. So if you have intensely a lot of pain impulses, it comes in. Actually, the RAS is at the base of the brain stem. So so the agony of being shot triggers the RAS to send out a signal weakening the muscles of the legs, causes the person to collapse. And in fact, I was prepared with a source link, so I'm gonna just stick that right here while we're talking. Um, so anyway, that so that would explain Hiram collapsing, falling to his knees. So it wouldn't necessarily have caused him to move forward. I mean, it may have given him a slight push forward, like i.e. towards the door. But it's very likely he fell to his knees and began to fall forward simply because, like, anatomically, men fall forward. When we get shot by a gun, our center of mass is in the front, just right below the sternum, kind of at the top of the stomach. And so men naturally fall forward when they collapse. Women fall backwards because a woman's center of gravity is, in the region of the buttocks, and so it's much lower and in their rear center of gravity, so they fall backwards. So now, as he was falling to his knees and then began to fall forward, Hiram would have also had a natural, like, biological reaction to investigate what he probably was expecting to see as an exit wound. I mean, we know it struck his pocket watch in his right breast pocket, and so, like, if you do it, if you just start to, I don't have a pocket right here, but if I started to glance down at my right breast pocket, you'll notice that I am exposing the left side of my nose to a shot directly in front of me. So while Hiram's head was beginning to bend down and to examine his chest, and while likely beginning to fall forward, and so immediately after uttering the words, "I'm a dead man," that's when I believe the ball that penetrated the door was fired and struck him, entering on the left side of his nose. And so, like, basically, Hiram was being 10 feet back from the door. That addresses the angle of the bullet hole in the door. And that would also account for there being no muzzle burn from the muzzle flash and no splintering from the door, etc. So the ball entered on the left side of his nose, exited below his jaw, but above his neck. So now it's important to note that the only point of evidence against the neck, that the neck wound was an entrance wound, was the coroner's report, and he identified it as an entrance wound. But what's very interesting, and what I found doing some research, was that modern trauma surgeons have determined that entrance and exit wounds are misinterpreted over half the time, even today, 52% of the time to be exact, which I have that source link I'm going to post here in the comments as well. And so, because of this phenomenon of misidentifying it over half the time, I'm quoting from another journal article, current forensic recommendations are that trauma clinicians not document the interpretation of a wound as an entrance or exit. The wound should only be described in detail and, if possible, photographed, unquote. And so that article was published on the National Library of Medicine. And there's that link right there. So basically, the modern surgeons and forensics experts are, I mean, I don't think it's a stretch to say they're far more trained and have far more technological tools at their disposal than existed 180 years ago on the American frontier. And so I can only imagine that even more than 50% of the time, entry and exit wounds were misidentified in the 1840s. So that doesn't necessarily discredit the coroner, or, it's not intended to be a criticism of him or him. It's just that these things are difficult to identify. And so modern protocol is to not identify or interpret those things. So now, in addition, so we know that bullets are not lasers. So that same peer-reviewed article that was published in the National Library of Medicine that I just linked, it says, quote, "Bullets that strike rigid changes in density, such as bone, will often be deflected from their initial course." So these are not my words. These are the words of actual forensics experts in a printed, published, peer-reviewed study in the National Library of Medicine. In fact, that same study goes on to reference a specific case where, quote, "A bullet had penetrated the chest, entered the left pulmonary vein," or, the vein on the left side of the lungs, "and embolized to the left femoral artery." So, I mean, just let that sink in. Imagine somebody gets shot by a gun a modern firearm, not a 180 years ago firearm, and it hits him in the chest, and there's no exit wound in their back, and they're like, "Where's the bullet?" They find it in his left thigh. I mean, truth can be stranger than fiction, in other words. And so it's not uncommon for bullet trajectories to change in unpredictable and sometimes dramatic ways after impacting or penetrating a human body. And so given that this particular bullet that struck the left side of Hiram's face was most likely a roughly 50 caliber or half-inch diameter musket ball that had just passed through 3/4 of an inch of solid hardwood. So upon striking Hiram's face bones while his head was angled slightly downward, the ball's trajectory changed slightly more down, and as it exited here, it grazed Hiram's vest in 2 places, which we know from the shirt, there is evidence that a bullet grazed him. It didn't penetrate the skin, there's no record of that, but it did graze his vest in 2 places. So those 2 graze marks could be examined today. I haven't examined them. I don't think you have either. But so after receiving that wound to his face, Hiram then fell to the floor. I believe it was face down, at least initially. And the eyewitness accounts do put him lying on his back. I think it's very possible that he could have been rolled over onto his back at some point in all the chaos, but I do think that he fell on his face initially, because that matches the biological center of mass argument. And I'm not faulting the eyewitness accounts for getting that little detail wrong, because he could have easily been flipped over to positively determine that he was deceased.
Flipped over by them, or you mean
yeah,
after the fact?
well, by anyone. So I believe that he bled out, and the actual cause of death was deprivation of oxygen to the brain.
From
Now,
the head wound?
no, because here's the thing: like, to bleed out, it's a surprising amount of blood. I mean, imagine in your mind like a half-gallon jug of milk. Imagine dumping that onto the floor once, a full half-gallon jug of milk, and then filling it halfway up again and dumping it out. That's about how much blood is in a full-grown male human being. And so to bleed out would cause, from his face, there would be a huge puddle. And so, but because the back wound, there would be very little external bleeding, but inside your body, inside your abdominal cavity, there's a lot of empty space that your guts are just kind of, floating around in. And so I believe the majority of him bleeding out happened internally, which was not externally visible. And so, and because he was laying on his face, at least initially, it did not exit the hole in his back. So, and then when the mob returned and opened fire at John Taylor and Joseph's, Hiram's corpse was struck twice more in lower extremities, but no sign of blood. So he was probably bleeding out. And
So you believe the mob came back?
Yeah. Okay, so I guess before I go on to the evidence that after Joseph fired the 6-shooter through the door, went the gap. So, but before we get to that, I do think it's cool to mention, actually, and I'll attribute this. I'll give credit where it's due. So Kim sent me some sources that showed that there's documentation that both Joseph's and Hiram's bodies were placed on ice after they were martyred. Now, of course, back in those days, people didn't have freezers or fridges or electricity. So what they'd do is, in the middle of winter, they'd go to the nearest lake or pond or stream. They'd cut large blocks of ice. They'd carry them by wagon or sleigh to the local ice house, which, as the name suggests, was a special, like, extra insulated structure designed to store ice long term. And they'd pack the ice blocks in sawdust. Now, amazingly, these ice blocks would last well into the summer, sometimes through the summer. And you can Google this stuff. Like, if this isn't, it's this. I like to read old westerns and pioneer types of books. And so I grew up being aware of this. But if it's not something that you've ever seen before, feel free to Google it and just kind of validate this for yourself. So the reason that this is important is, as any mother would know, if blood gets onto fabric, like your kid gets a bloody nose or whatever, you don't want it to permanently stain the outfit. You take it off and soak it in cold water. So in other words, cold temperatures arrest the staining effect of blood. Now, the reason I think this is noteworthy is because, while I did say that there were no major blood vessels in the region where Hiram was struck in the back, there are small capillaries in the skin that I would expect to see at least some bleeding. And yet Hiram's shirt has no blood stains on the back whatsoever, despite a .69 caliber bullet hole being there. So I believe that the explanation there is that when they placed his and Joseph's bodies on ice, it prevented the blood stains on his back from becoming permanent, and so they were able to be washed out later. Okay, so back to the room in Carthage. So immediately after Hiram was struck with the first bullet in his back, hearing him cry that he was a dead man, Joseph exclaimed, "Oh, my dear brother Hiram," and made the decision to fire his 6-shooter revolver at the men trying to enter the door. I believe Joseph would have never left the room, because from his point of view, there was literally a mob of armed men on the other side of the door that he knew were intent on killing him. They had just killed his brother. So he drew the weapon, shot through the opening of the door, hitting 3 mob members, and apparently it misfired 3 times. But that caused the mob to temporarily retreat. How long? Maybe a few seconds, maybe a minute or 2. I don't know. But I believe that the mob quickly regrouped and could be heard coming back up the stairs to finish the job they'd come to do. Now, as they could hear the mob returning, that's when John Taylor decided to check if there was any hope of escape from the window. And he was struck by bullets shot from the mob members at the door coming into the room, and he thought he would fall out the window because he was like leaning forward. He thought he was going to fall out at the time, and he didn't know why he didn't, and fell down inside the room. Now later on, it was discovered that his pocket watch was broken and had a small caliber bullet hole in it, which was speculated had been struck by a bullet from outside, and that was the reason John Taylor hadn't fallen out the window. Now, since your documentary attempted to portray that could have never happened, I'm going to just say here that the results of your experiment, you shooting the pocket watch, don't surprise me at all, because it was a apples to oranges comparison. So the reason I'm going to say that is because to actually replicate and test the effect of shooting a pocket watch that was on a human person's body, you'd need to use some representation of a human body as the backdrop. Because when a bullet strikes a target, there's forces, which in the laws of physics are defined as mass times velocity. Bullets are small in mass but very high velocity, so there's an amazing amount of force packed in a small package. That force, when it encounters an equal or opposite force, gets transferred. That kinetic force, that movement gets transferred into the target. Now, not enough to blow a guy back 20 feet like in Hollywood. That's just fantasy. But if a man was off balance, like falling forward, and a bullet struck and was brought to a complete stop by something in the man's pocket, is it plausible that it could change the direction he was falling? Absolutely, yes. In addition, if that energy was dispersed through the human body behind the watch, and the watch didn't absorb all of that energy, it wouldn't necessarily have to be blown to shreds. So in your experiment, you had a wooden board behind it, and so all of that force from the bullet impacting was absorbed by the watch, and predictably it got blown to shreds. That's expected by anybody that understands terminal ballistics. But so my point is that your setup was fundamentally flawed. Now, also the caliber of the bullet that struck John Taylor's pocket watch was not a 69 caliber musket ball, which would have a lot more force because it's a lot more mass. And so the hole in his pocket watch is pretty small. Like I've never actually handled the pocket watch and measured the diameter, but to me it looks more like a 22 type of a caliber, which would have been fired from a sidearm, not a musket, by one of the mob members below. Okay, so John is struck by 4 balls, falls to the floor, rolls under the bed. Now, there was a point of there being 2 windows in the room. So if John went to the smaller window, that could explain why Joseph would go to the other larger window. But regardless, even if John Taylor went to the larger window, which would make more sense in my mind, that he was afraid that he was going to fall out.
What do you mean? There's 3 windows. Which 2 windows are you talking about?
I'm referring to, there's the large window, which is directly across from the door. And then there's like, if you're like we always put the door on the left side, all the painters depictions, and because the door's in the far left corner, and so we always look at it from that perspective. So if the door's on the left, the window's on the right, there was another window behind, above, like where the bed was, right?
So he jumped on the bed and tried to go through that window. Is that what you mean?
Possibly, like, he doesn't, there's no action. I didn't see any indication from either of the eyewitness accounts him identifying specifically which window he went to. I'm just saying that regardless, like if he went to the window above the bed, that could explain why Joseph would go to the other window across from the door, right? But even if John Taylor went to the large window directly across the opposite wall from the door, I think it's still reasonable, given that there were no other possible exits or escapes from that room, from that situation, besides a window. So anyway, as Joseph rushes to the window, the mob, which has breached the door, fires upon him from behind. And Willard, of course, was hidden from view of the mob because he was on the hinge side of the door. So the mob forces the door open, forces him into the corner behind the door. He is out of sight, out of mind, maybe.
So do
Um,
you believe that's just your theory, or because he said he was on the other side, but then told the coroner that he was behind the door? So you
I
say
I think that in the heat of the moment, in the stress, it's very likely he could have misremembered upon later recollection.
he misremembered that he was behind the door the whole
Yeah,
time?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Especially if human nature is to embellish over time, and in fact, it would be remarkable if people didn't. That's why they call them the big fish stories, right? The fish gets bigger and bigger the more times you tell the story, and that's just a natural part of human nature. That doesn't mean that it wasn't a big fish to begin with. It just means that over time things tend to get exaggerated, and that's just human nature. So I have no problem. I'm not accusing Willard of being like a malicious liar for making embellishments if he did that. I just believe that it's far more likely the fact that he was never struck by balls, unless possibly the ear grazing. But I think that it's far more likely that he was behind the door at the time that Joseph was fired upon. And so anyway, so in the act of Joseph trying to jump out the window, he was struck by balls shot from behind, from the mob at the door
Yep.
of the room, as well as in front. And as a result of those shots, he stumbled and fell headfirst out of the window, hit the ground with his forehead first. And there's evidence that he was not instantly killed because he leaned up against the wall and was beaten,
Mhm.
at least according to one of the mob members, before he died. And so Willard, if he was behind the door, and the mob immediately rushed out after Joseph was their target, clearly. And so as the mob saw that he was no longer in the room, they would have rushed out and down the stairs. And so Willard would have been relatively safe. Now, he's a big guy for sure, about 300 pounds by accounts. But like we discussed last time, nobody's going to approach a window casually when you just saw your friend or two of your friends, or maybe three. Like, so Hiram, John, and Joseph were all shot through this same window minutes before. He would have crept up and he would have, peeked over the bottom of the sill. Now, today the ledge might have a larger overhang. Maybe back in 1844 it was the same ledge, or maybe it was replaced in one of the multiple remodels since that time. Regardless, it's possible that his ear was grazed by a stray shot. It doesn't necessarily mean that if it wasn't, it makes him a liar, because again, human nature is to embellish things over time. But he wouldn't have just been sitting there like staring. He would have glanced quickly and then ducked back under cover. So the idea that he had to fill the window is just unsupported by human nature, let alone any historical evidence. And so now, so if the martyrdom happened today, I think this is important. Another important point is, like, in a modern forensics team went to the untampered with crime scene, sure, it's likely they'd be able to determine tons more facts than what we have access to today. But the facts of this matter is that the martyrdom happened nearly 180 years ago. Modern forensic tech did not exist at the time. The bodies have been buried. There's no crime scene. Um, it's been 180 years. The jail's been remodeled. So like we don't have the bullets. We don't have blood splatters. We don't have pictures of the bodies where they were lying. The crime scene has been tampered with. Obviously, we don't have the murder weapons or the muskets that were involved. We don't have the pistols. Um, I think I already said that, but it was like multiple remodels in the time. So there was a blood stain apparently on the floor up until I think it was President Kimball in the 60s or 70s or something said, let's clean that up. Um, and so we know that the window and the frame were replaced. And so that could have easily included the window ledge. Also another important thing is back east, like I served a mission in Detroit and I've spent time working in the South in the summertime and stuff. It's very common to pressure wash the exteriors of buildings out there just because of the climate. And so like in addition to 180 years worth of weathering, to me, pressure washing could explain why, modern visitors, we go and we don't see visible evidence of musket balls striking the exterior. Okay, so that's kind of the theory, but I have just a few final statements, if that's okay, before you dive in and ask questions. Is that cool?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right on. So I think it's important to say that it's impossible for me to actually prove my own theory that's what really happened. As you stated multiple times in our last conversation, now you said I kind of tried to ask you a couple of different times, couple of different ways about motive, like asked you to speak to motive, which you declined to do. But as a quick aside, I have a good friend. His brother has been a homicide detective in Arizona for many years, and I didn't, no context. I just asked, and he said that as a homicide detective, he would never consider investigating forensic evidence in a vacuum, like without investigating motive. So anyway, as I thought through all of these points, I anticipated several possible objections that you could bring up to discredit my story, my theory. And as I was thinking about it, I realized something very important that you said a few times in our last meeting, and that's about epistemology. Are you familiar with that term? Kind of a scholarly. So epistemology just being, how do you determine what is true? And I think, that, well, I heard you say many times that you believe that what is most likely is probably what is true. So your epistemology would be what is the most likely, what is probable, probability would be your epistemology in this situation. And explicitly, like exclusively based on the forensic evidence. So to kind of just illustrate what that means, the implications is like if we take two dice and we roll them, it must be a 7. The result must be a 7. We don't look at the results and look at it. We say it has to be a 7 because that is the highest probability outcome. It couldn't be a 2, couldn't be a 12 because those are less probable than a 7. There's way more combinations of dice to get to 7. And so that's most likely. Or similarly, the odds of a person who buys lottery tickets or who like goes and plays a slot machine in Vegas, their odds of winning the jackpot are statistically minuscule, like infinitesimally small. And so by your epistemology, it would be impossible for anyone to ever win the lottery or the jackpot because it's so unlikely. And yet we all know it happens every day to all sorts of people. So this is my objective analysis of a fundamental flaw to your approach. In addition, let's define another term that you like to throw around, the forensic science. Like forensic science is scientific, meaning there's no room for conjecture. So this requires being able to examine and positively identify the bullet, location of impact, trajectory or trajectories involved in a pristine, uncontaminated and controlled scene. That being the case, as you said in our last conversation, that like you had to make a bunch of assumptions and fill in holes in your conclusions as you presented them. That's not forensic science. Science is disciplined, it's reproducible, it's neither of us has actually seen the bullets, neither of us has actually handled the murder weapons, neither of us has physically examined the shirt or the skull or the pocket watch. Maybe you have, I don't know, I haven't, or examined the room in its condition immediately after the martyrdom. In other words, neither of us has any business to even claim the forensic evidence can provide a scientific answer. We have very little. We have a hole in a door, we have some pictures of some skulls, and we have a shirt with some holes and bloodstains. That's about it. But anyway, so despite your epistemology being what is the most probable thing, I don't believe your documentary is even about that. Because like, what's the probability that John Taylor and Willard Richards were armed when we know there was no evidence whatsoever they had guns with them in that room? Also motive is a massive aspect of probability. Like anybody, I like enjoy reading and watching murder mysteries. Anybody that sees a murder mystery knows that if I had told you that a guy had threatened to divorce his wife and was not going to give her support, and then the next day he's found dead, probability would make the wife, the widow, a leading suspect in that investigation. So like in the context of Carthage, what is the probability that two guys are going to stage a murder of two friends while they're in the room with them, and a mob with guns is shooting at their targets? Like there are so many more probable ways that if John and Willard wanted to kill Joseph and Hiram, they could have poisoned them. No risk to themselves. Joseph and Hiram, we know, were unarmed on their trip from Nauvoo to Carthage, meaning they could have killed him in transit. Like at any point on that road where there's no witnesses, a mob wasn't shooting at them, they weren't possibly able to get caught in the crossfire. So why pick a room when you're right next to your intended victims and incite a mob to only hang him? And yet you did acknowledge that shots were fired from the mob outside. So to me, a much better epistemology than probability is reason. Like, for example, our legal system is more concerned about finding the truth than any other, earthly institution, because justice cannot be served, cannot prevail if the truth is not reached. So for this reason, the standard of our justice system is reason, not probability.